Hey everybody, it's Kyle with Simulation Lab here in Brooklyn, New York. Back again with another 3D Studio Max crash course guide. This time we're going to be covering materials and some basic render settings that you can use when setting up your scenes for render. This is like some tips and tricks that I use all the time when I'm making my personal digital art. Stuff like just basic materials and lighting and stuff that I typically use for this kind of stuff. And of course my professional work too, doing things with architectural visualization and 3D motion graphics. Um, let's jump into Max. So I got Max open. First thing we're going to do real quick is customize our unit setup. We're going to leave it as generic units if you're following along. System units is 1 unit equals 1 inch. And if you're brand new to 3D Studio Max, I definitely recommend checking out the beginner's crash course guide on using 3D Studio Max. It's a video. I'll post a link in the description. I also have another video about how to 3D model pretty much anything. So you can find that on my channel as well. So if you've watched those and you're pretty much familiar with the general interface of Max, chances are you probably have popped up in the material editor and tried to render some stuff out. And if you run into any trouble, this will be a good video to start with as far as lighting as materials and lighting and stuff like that goes. So without further ado, we'll jump into Max. We'll kind of model a couple quick things and set up a little scene and start playing around with some materials. So first things first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create some spheres and turn on my edge faces, and I'm just gonna change my segments to something like 50, make it slightly more smooth, and I'm gonna copy this, make 4 copies of this, and maybe I'll copy this up as well. I'm gonna move the whole thing up. These are just gonna be some test spheres that we're gonna toss some materials on, pretty much. And so what I'll do is I'll create a little backdrop plane like that. I'll center this guy out. I'll get rid of all my length and width segments, and I'll toss on an edit poly modifier on here. Gonna drive this back plane up. We'll grab that back edge and I'll toss a chamfer modifier on there. Set it to standard chamfer, and increase the amount pretty high up. Something like that should be good. And I'll set my segments to like 40. Boom. Alright, and then real quick, I'm going to go my top view, and I'm just going to create a camera. You guys can create a standard camera, any kind of camera you want. I'm eventually going to convert the scene to FStorm, which is a different rendering engine, and I'll explain some of that stuff later. We're also going to be covering some basic render settings further toward the end of the video, or further along in the video here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a basic FStorm camera. I'll plop it in my scene there. I'll grab the pivot and the camera itself and just zero out the X. And then I'm just going to raise this guy up, raise it up a little bit more, something like that. And I'm going to set my camera here from my viewport here to see through my camera. I'm going to change this to default shading. Awesome. Now we're ready to rock and roll. So a couple things. With the material editor, you can bring it up with the M key. So if you just type M, brings up the material editor. And again, you can find that material editor here. Click on the little toolbar icon there. It'll pop it up. There's a couple different types of material editors, which we'll cover which each one kind of does. So this is the standard material editor. If you just install Max, chances are this is what's going to show up if you type M or if you click on the toolbar. Now, if you hold on the hold down, on the toolbar icon, you can hover down to with this little icon here, and this is the slate material editor. So they both are fundamentally the same thing. They both do the same things. This is more of a sort of like node graph visual GUI, like graphic user interface, for the material editor. This is super helpful if you're creating, like complex materials that are blending different, texture maps and stuff together that you'd like to see that visually represented in a graph. It's really great for that sort of thing. Like say for instance, if I wanted to choose a material like a bitmap or something, and I could plug that right into any one of these channels, and it's really great for visually representing what the material is doing, what's being fed to what. The other material, I'll go ahead and just delete this. The other material editor, if I hold this down and go back to the regular standard one, is fundamentally the same thing, right? This just has a series of shader swatches that you can see. You can kind of preview what your material looks like. And you can choose and you can click on any one of these particular material swatches to see what the parameters are that's being fed to that material. Now, if I double click on one of these swatches, it opens it up and I can basically get a more larger view of what this is doing. And if I want to see more or less of the shader swatches here, I could type the X key. And the X key will cycle through having different amounts of rows. You can see like larger if you're, if your scene has less materials, maybe you want to see, less swatches. I usually just keep it at the standard 4x6 grid that it has here because I, typically use a lot of materials in my scene, and sometimes it's just easier to see them directly like that. Yeah. So anyway, so further down, like in this, these are all your material parameters. This is where you can rename your material. Like you could just do like a standard mat. So like you can rename a material, and you could choose the basic shader parameters. There's all kinds of different options here, which will cover which each one of them does in a little bit here. And you can choose all kinds of different classifications of the general material types. So we'll jump into this a little bit more. And next thing I want to look at real quick is just some general render settings. So if you type the 9 key, if you type the 9 key, the render setup dialog box is going to pop up here, and of course you could always open it from the toolbar up here. See if we pop that guy open, you're going to get your basic render settings. So if you're brand new to 3D Studio Max, basically these settings are universal to any kind of rendering engine, which we'll talk briefly about the different types of rendering engines and why some are better than others and stuff like that. So these are fundamental to pretty much all the different types of rendering engines you're going to get for Max. So it has basically all the same settings. So we'll cover very briefly what this stuff means. So this is for, if you're rendering a single frame, just one image, or if you're rendering a time segment of the timeline, let's say for an animation, for instance, you can specify the amount of frames that you want to render out, or specific frames if you want to. You can set an area to view, or let's say for selected or something like that to in the particular through the particular camera that you're looking through, or the viewport that you're looking through. You can specify your output size, which you could do like HD TV or something. The standard size for 1080p, or you can do like a custom size, which I, for Instagram typically do like, let's say 1080 by 1080 for the standard portrait mode, which is a 1:1 aspect ratio. Or let's say, for instance, like you want to do portrait mode for Instagram, that would be 1350 by 1080. I'm sorry, 1080 by 1350. That would give you that elongated portrait view for Instagram if you want to do something like that. Otherwise, 1080 by 1080 is square pixel ratio. But in this case, we'll just use HDTV. So we'll just use 1920 by 1080. You have a bunch of different options here for rendering specific things in your scene, and your render output is where you're going to be saving your final rendered image. So that's just a brief overview of some of this stuff. we're going to be going into further depth of the all the different render settings in a separate video. But for this particular video, I'm just going to be briefly covering some render settings and focusing more specifically on the materials. So real quick, this is under your renderer. We have, Max comes out of the box by default with the scanline renderer, and I have a bunch of different rendering engines. I have Corona, I have FStorm, and I have V-Ray and Arnold. Arnold has now come standard with the Max installation, I think, which is a great rendering engine, but all of them do slightly different things. Let's say, for instance, Corona and FStorm and V-Ray. So there's a difference between GPU-based rendering engines, which runs on your graphics card, and CPU-based rendering engines, which runs on your processor, right? So the real difference between them is that GPU engines offer, close to real-time rendering capabilities, but they are limited to the amount of VRAM on your particular graphics card, right? Let's say if you have a really intense, awesome graphics card, top of the line, typically it comes with about 10, 11, 12 gigabytes of VRAM, which kind of limits the amount of geometry and materials that you can process in a particular rendering, right, in a particular scene. So if you're using huge amounts of instance objects, let's say for like trees or something like that to render a giant forest, or crazy huge bitmaps for materials, you might tap out that VRAM, which is a little bit limiting sometimes. And that's the difference between GPU and CPU based rendering, which CPU tends to be slower. It's not real time, rendering, but it can handle huge amounts of scene geometry, which is sort of more of a brute force method. But again, like a lot of my professional work, architectural visualization and stuff, like all this was rendered with FStorm and has a ton of scene geometry, a lot of high poly count objects, a lot of super high res textures and displacement and bump and all that kind of stuff, which we'll cover all that stuff. And this is just rendered on my single graphics card, way back then. Now I have 4 graphics cards, which definitely helps distribute the load of heavier scenes. But regardless, we'll jump back in here. So for the duration of this tutorial, I'm going to be using FStorm because it's just generally simpler. It's kind of like a what you see is what you get rendering engine, which is pretty great. So I just converted my scene to FStorm, and you can see all the material swatches went black. So what I'm going to have to do is under the FStorm settings, under tools, I'm going to convert scene to FStorm. Now, most of the other rendering engines like Corona and V-Ray have the same tool to allow you to convert your scene. It just might be, in a different spot or something. But you can do a quick Google search if you can't find in your particular rendering engine where to find that convert button, but most of them have it. So okay, I just converted my scene. You can see all of these are now standard FStorm materials now, which is awesome. So real quick, what we'll do is under kernel settings, just a couple basic rendering settings. Light samples, I'm going to set to 12. Max depth, we're going to set this to something like 24, a little bit higher, and I'll show you why a little bit later on. And I'm going to keep my noise threshold. Maybe we'll put our noise threshold to 001. And array threshold, we might increase this a little bit later on when we do some volumetric materials, because we're going to need that, or else we're going to get some artifacts to decrease this value as to little as possible when you do volumetric stuff. But of course, that comes at the cost of rendering time, right? So yeah, that's pretty much all we're going to use. And under environment, I'm going to toss in a texture map here. We're going to use an hdri map. So under FStorm render, if you're using FStorm, otherwise you can just use the general bitmap here. I'm going to use the FStorm bitmap, and I'm going to drag that and drop it into one of the swatches in my material editor as an instance. And click OK. I'm going to scroll down, and real quick, I'm just going to set up, this is just like a background texture that I have here for an hdri map. So that I got that HDR image here, and it gives you a little preview of what it's going to look like. And I'm going to click OK and keep everything default. Under gamma, I'm going to change this to 2.2. And under mapping, I'm going to change this to spherical environment. And that's just, now we're pretty much done with our basic scene setup, and we're ready to start really digging into some of these materials now. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse all this stuff. We don't really need it anymore. Maybe I'll set this to 2 or something to give us a little bit more light from that HDR, have it affect our materials a little bit more precisely. So I get to get rid of that. I'm going to get rid of that for now, and we'll set some stuff up. Maybe in our next to our background image here, I'll set up another little background material. And the way that you apply materials to an object is I'll kind of scroll around here. So the way you apply it is you can either drag this swatch onto the object, right, and drop it, or you can choose this little assign material to selection button, and that'll apply that material that you made to the object, right? So that's how to apply materials, basically. Now for the background, I could choose a different color, so maybe I'll choose like a little bit different color, and you can tell that the color is changing because I changed the diffuse channel color to something a little bit darker. And from here, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a couple quick lights. Again, lighting is something I'm going to cover probably more in depth in a future video when we do more in depth. Maybe we'll cover that during the render settings video, and maybe this will just be, or something. Maybe we'll cover that more specifically because there's a lot to lighting. There's a lot to learn. So I'm going to set up one light. This is going to be my primary light, and I'm going to set up another one as my secondary light. So this is going to like offer a little bit more light bounce, right? And I'm just arbitrarily placing this stuff in here, and you guys can of course be much more precise and go back and tweak all this stuff, but just for now, quick and dirty, I'm going to set my power to this secondary light to 4 and my primary light to something like 10. And that's going to be it for our render setup. Now if we go ahead and under our render settings, under interactive render, again, depending on what your rendering engine is, you probably have an interactive render, or just, you click on the big render button and this thing will fire up, and boom, you got your scene. Now we don't have any materials applied yet, except for the background, but yeah, that'll be our next step. So we're going to fill each one of these spheres with a different type of material, different material. Okay, so I'll drag this over here for now. And the first thing we're going to do is on this first swatch here, we're just going to create like a basic glossy material. So we'll just do like glossy, right? And we'll kind of see how that starts to look. So now I'm going to go ahead and assign material to selection now that I have it selected. And we'll go ahead and make this like a red or something, right? Now if I just have the material as red, it's just going to show up pretty boring. It's just like there's not much surface information. It's very flat. A couple things I can do though. Of course, there's all these different parameters, all these different settings in this particular material that I can adjust. Now, these settings and the names of them are fundamentally universal to most rendering engines, right? The standard max scanline, iRay, Arnold, and even engines like V-Ray and Corona, and even GPU engines like, of course, FStorm and Octane, all have fundamentally these similar names, these similar named parameters, right? So IOR can control the sort of like overall reflectivity of an object, and it's sort of like refraction as well. It's kind of a funny parameter, which we'll play around with this when we make some metal materials. You have your reflection, which of course black is no reflection and white is the most reflection the material can have. So I just set this to white, and you can see it's kind of reflective, but there's not much like glossiness, right? So you can control the glossiness level with this parameter here. So right now it's set to 0.1, which is super low, right? If I set it to 1, it's going to be very reflective. Right? So you can already see I'm seeing my hdri map in the reflection of the sphere and along with my two lights that I set up. Right? Now if I don't want to see the reflections of those lights, just one quick tip, I can lock my viewport so I can jump out to different viewports. One quick tip here, most lights from most rendering engines have a visibility checkbox. So I can click uncheck that and you can see right away that the light is now invisible in my scene. And I can click on the secondary light, uncheck visibility, boom, it's done. So now all I see in my reflection is just the hdri background, which is cool. Okay, so now let's play with this a little bit more. So, if I want to set this to, like this is like pretty cool. It's a very glossy, almost like a glossy plastic or painted metal or something like that. But if I want it to be more metallic, like more like of a mirror, I could set my IOR to something like 2 or 5, something like that. Now it's becoming more like a chrome, right? So I'm going to leave that at 1.5 for now, and we'll jump back to IOR a little bit later. All different types of settings that FStorm has. Again, this is pretty much fundamental to most rendering engines. And then you have down here you have all of your maps, right? We're gonna go over like what most of these mean. Again, this is just a basic crash course guide, so we're not going to get too deep into all of these. Just so this, or else this tutorial would be 10 hours long. So we'll create our next material here. Next one we're going to do is a basic glass material. And in our diffuse channel, typically we want to make glass materials diffuse channel is going to be black because there's no color, right? So I'm going to set my diffuse to be totally black, right? I'm going to reset my reflection to be pretty much all the way white almost, and my glossiness to something like 0.8, something like that. And you can see it's like a really reflective black material, which that doesn't look like glass at all. And now we play with your refraction settings, right? So under the color, black is no refraction, and as you guessed it, white would be total refraction, right? So now we have a glass sphere. And if I jump out of this viewport and jump back into my perspective viewport, I can kind of scroll up on this guy and I can unlock my viewport so I can kind of get to pan around it a little bit. And you can see it's behaving like a glass material, like things are refracting through it. Right? Which that's pretty cool. So now that's a solid glass ball, right? And now let's say if I did something like, really quickly, if I modeled something inside of it, like, I don't know, like a cube or something. Let's model a little cube. Right, I'm not going to get too fancy with it. Maybe we'll just do like 8 by 8 by 8. And I'm going to toss in we'll just toss in the, like just some other material, maybe just like this, just like, kind of like a white. And I'll go ahead and align it to the center of that. Oops, you know what I'll do is I'll, under my pivot, effect pivot only, center to object. And if you guys watch the how to model anything, we covered all that stuff. How to model anything video in my channel. And we'll click align and we'll align the cube to the center of that sphere. And we'll kind of see what that looks like when we render it out. So go ahead and refresh it. So now you see there's like you can see a cube in there, but it's acting really strangely. That's because it's within a solid cube of glass, right? So it's a little bit weird. And we can play with the refraction a little bit, but ultimately if you wanted to have the glass be like a shell, have a thickness to it, it's going to look different. So what we'll do is take a glass material and we'll toss this on this sphere, right? And we'll go ahead and do a shell modifier. And we'll leave it maybe about, something like that will be fine for now. And I'll grab my cube, we'll copy it over, and I'm going to align it to this sphere. And we'll see what that looks like. So if I refresh it, now you can see that the glass it's almost like a film, kind of like a bubble. And And if I scroll up into that, you can tell that there's a thickness to the glass, which is pretty cool. And now, of course, you could play with these settings all you want and get the glass to be super reflective or super transparent if you want. And it kind of just depends. It's kind of up to you. You can set the IOR to 2 or something. You can kind of see how the reflection around the glass is kind of like warping around it, which is kind of interesting. Usually glass, I think, has a standard IOR rating of like 1.65 or something like that. To kind of ground it in the real world. So yeah, there you go. I mean, that's how you would do architectural glass, like something like a window. You would have to give it a thickness, or if you want to render soap bubbles or something, you'd have to give them a slight thickness, or else objects inside of them or objects are refracting through them will look a little strange if they're completely solid glass. Okay, so the next quick material that we're going to look at doing is going to be chrome. So we'll go ahead and create our chrome material. And I say chrome, I mean more of like a metallic material. It could be chrome, it could be gold, it could be bronze or brass or something like that. But in this case, we'll just go ahead and create a chrome material, and we'll apply that to our object. We have it selected here. And chrome, we'll do, we could do black for the diffuse color. Reflection is going to be close to white. Glossiness, we can do 0.85 or something like that. Again, you can adjust all that stuff depending on what you want the thing to look like, right? And IOR is going to be something like 10. We'll start with 10. Now, if I double click on my chrome sphere, obviously it's going to look like that, right? It's looking pretty chromy. So now if I go ahead and update that, cool. So now you can tell it's starting to reflect all of the spheres around. It's starting to get my hdri map, and it's starting to get really reflective. Now I can set my glossiness to be 1, right? And that'll give me like a perfectly reflective sphere, right? And if that's something that you want, awesome. Typically materials aren't perfectly reflective. Even mirrors are a slightly non-reflective, to a certain extent, right? So if you're going to do a perfect mirror, what I would suggest is putting on like a reflection texture map, or even like a texture map in the glossy channel to maybe add a little bit of dirt or maybe some fingerprints and stuff. And like stuff like that is like materials that you can find or you can purchase. You can even look at websites like I have this one up, textures.com. There's all kinds of different stuff. I mean, there's tons of different materials on here, and even materials for like overlays, like stuff like water droplets and stuff like dirt and stuff that normally that would be on like a reflective object, fingerprints and stuff like that. So just keep that in mind. That is that's something that to enhance the realism of your particular scene, just all things that you can do to your material to bring out just even more realism. Okay, so the next material that we're going to cover, which real quick, I could show you if we drag and drop this material to a different slot, it's going to copy it, but it's going to copy it as just a pure copy, right? So I can name this one gold, something, and I can bring down my glossiness a little bit. Let's do 0.85 or something, and I'll just go ahead and maybe I'll copy this one again. I'll just to show you what it's going to look like. And I'll apply the gold material there. I'll just kind of go ahead and refresh this. And, similar thing, like if you want to create a gold, you can just basically find a color in your reflection color slot. And you can kind of play with this, and you can kind of get like that sort of like desaturated kind of like gold look to it. It almost looks more like a brass or bronze at this point, but you can kind of play with that. Even if you want to change the color up and have like a chrome, like a very reflective colored sphere or something. Could use your colored object. So all different stuff that you could play with, which is really cool. Awesome. So next material up, we're going to go slightly further down the rabbit hole now. So we're going to do something with emissive materials. So we'll just name this one like light bulb or something. I don't know. So we're going to play around with some emissive materials. So I'm going to select this sphere. I'm going to apply this material to that sphere. And I'm going to leave all the settings default for now. And under emission, I'm going to turn emission on. And I'm going to change my color to something like maybe a blue or some aquamarine. Maybe we'll get a little bit sci-fi here. And I'm going to crank up my power just to 1 for now and kind of see what that looks like. You could tell what's happening here. It's starting to emit light. Now if I crank that up to like 10, now it's really going to start emitting light, and you can tell what's happening. It's emitting light on my scene. I can even choose direct illumination, which is going to really pump even more light. It's going to treat that object as more of a light than an object. So it's going to be calculating light bounces from that object, which is pretty cool. So I can crank that way up, say like 500, and we'll see what that does. So like it starts to now you can tell like the bloom starts happening on my camera lens, which is pretty cool. So we'll drop this down to something like 20. Again, all these parameters are, of course, like highly editable, and you can kind of tweak them to your heart's desire to make all kinds of different complex materials. So the next material that we're going to make is going to be kind of like it's going to be a volumetric material. What I mean by that is like it's a material that you would apply to things like fog or smoke, things that allow light to pass through them, but kind of give this like sort of like a particular like particle look to them. So we'll name this one smoke. And I'll grab that next sphere here, and I'll go ahead and slap this material on there. And so we'll go ahead and look at this through the camera, so we get a broad view of everything we got so far. And in my smoke material, what I'm going to do is set the diffuse channel to black, because we don't want any but diffuse color. I'm going to set the IOR to 1, because that's the lowest possible IOR you can have. And now we have a pure black material. So if you want to make a black hole, set the IOR to 1, and you're diffused to black, and you're good to go. And the reflection I'm going to keep black, and refraction I'm going to set that to pure white, all the way white, right? Now that gives me a completely transparent material, right? Now I can't even see it in my viewport, right? Or in the renderer or anything. But now I'm going to control the material with this volume parameter, these volume parameters down here. So absorption is completely white. That's why we can't see it. So if I set it to, gray, now it starts to pop up, right? Now I can set that to maybe a little bit darker, something like black, and our scattering, we can set that to a little bit lighter. And that affects the surface of it. So like the surface, like is the depth of as the light bounces through, the depth of the material, it kind of gives this soft cotton ball look effect, which you can tweak to make even more look like fog. And the way we do that is with the distance parameter. So if I set that to something like 50, it's going to become even more less dense, if that makes sense. And I can kind of tweak these parameters to get it to where like the more deep the camera is looking through the object, like the thicker the object, right? The more dense part of the object is going to be darker, right? So in this case, the sphere, the densest part of the object is of course the center of the sphere, right? So like it's looking more black in the center, and it kind of fades out, has this fall off effect, which is pretty cool. So we kind of like look around this thing in the perspective viewport and kind of see what that thing's looking like. So you can tell that it allows you to see through the object, so you can see this other sphere through the object, which is pretty cool. It's a very cool effect. So this is like a sort of a side note, but if you're using particle systems, like let's say for instance, if you're using Phoenix FD or RealFlow or something. A lot of those don't have, a lot of those types of plugins are difficult to render on a GPU-based rendering engine, right? The reason for that is they account for huge amounts of particles, right? And you have to render each one of those particles, and it's a giant amount of information to process on a single GPU, right? But the way to fake it is by setting those particular particle systems to have a mesh, right? So Phoenix FD, you're able to set the render setting in the render settings of Phoenix FD when you're rendering like smoke, for instance. You can set it to render mesh, and then you can apply a material like this to that mesh, and it'll look just like smoke, which is a handy little tip for you. So anyway, yeah, that's how you do, you know, very simple volumetric materials. So you can render things like clouds and smoke and fog and stuff like that. Okay, so the last two materials, we're going to be looking at using texture maps, right? And we're going to be looking at using the UVW Map modifier and a couple other modifiers to allow you to get some pretty cool effects using texture maps, right? So in this next material, we're going to call this one wood. I'll just do a simple wood material, right? If I scroll down under the diffuse channel, I'm going to click this little checkbox if we want to be able to use the map. And I'm going to click on where it says no map. I'm going to go fstorm bitmap. You can use a standard bitmap, doesn't matter. And under the file where it says file, go ahead and open this guy up. And I got a wood material set up already. So I click on wood. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this sphere here, and I'm going to slap my wood. I'm going to slap my wood material on the sphere, right? So, all right, so kind of go in the perspective viewport and look and see how that's looking. Now we can visualize what the wood material looks like in the scene by clicking this little show shaded material in viewport button. So I click on that guy, and at least you can see what it's looking like in the scene, and I can even turn off my edge faces. We don't need that. So awesome. Now this is a very boring wood. Indeed, very boring, right? You want to spice up that wood a little bit, right? Typically wood has reflection, right? So if it's a polished wood, if it has a glossy coat on the wood, like if you brand new chair or something that might have a glossiness to it, right? So we can add a little bit of reflectivity to it, maybe something like that. Kind of just play around with this, and a little bit of glossiness, something like 0.6 maybe. Yeah, there you go. And now that is a very highly polished, perfect wood surface, right? Now typically in the real world, wood would have a grain to it, right? So we need to use a bump map to give a little bit of a bump texture, a little bit of a surface information to the wood material, right? And the way we do that is we have to create a bump map, right? And stick it in this bump map slot here, right? Now the way bump maps work is that typically what you can do, like a very easy way to do this, what we'll do is I'll go ahead and pop open Photoshop, and I will take my wood material that we just referenced, and I'll stick that in Photoshop and open it up. Okay? And this is assuming that you have Photoshop. It's very important as a 3D artist to always have Photoshop and be able to use it for texture maps whenever you need to. If you're using things like Substance Painter or Quixel Mixer or whatever, those sorts of programs, are very, robust, and you can do all kinds of different material painting and stuff like that. But for this tutorial, this is very basic. I'll show you how to create a quick bump map, right? So a bump map, the channel reads black and white, right? And the gradient between, right? Black, white, and gray, right? So black is the depth, is like the lower parts of the bump, right? So you can imagine the surface variation of wood in the grain. The deep parts of the grain is going to be black, right? And the high parts, the peaks of the grain, are going to be white, right? And then all in between is going to be gray, gradients of gray, right? So I have my material set up here, my texture map loaded in Photoshop, and I'll go ahead and really quickly, I'll toss on a black and white filter. And we got a black and white. All right, cool. And then I'll toss in a levels filter. And this is just super quick and dirty. I'm going to set my blacks to pretty far black, right? Set my whites to pretty white, right? And I want to get at least a little bit of like, I don't want completely black, completely white, but I want to get a little bit of variation in there, just to get some more of those grays flowing in between. And depending on the resolution of your texture map, that's really going to pop out. So I'll go ahead and do Control-Shift-S, and I'll save this as a JPEG. And I'll just rename this bump. Cool. And bump maps are different than displacement maps, which is what we're going to be looking at next, but we'll continue with our wood example here. So in our bump channel here, I'm going to go ahead and toss in another bitmap. And under File, I'm going to go ahead and choose the bump map we just made. Okay. So now if I continuing rendering this, it's going to look terrible, which is because it's too high up. So we'll set this to something like 0.2, which is something really low. There we go. So now we start to see that surface information, right? Which is awesome. And it still looks very, it's kind of fake. I mean, this is like for a very rustic wood. Maybe we would do something like that. So maybe drop our glossiness down, and so like it becomes more rustic. But if we want to keep our glossiness there, I'm just going to turn this down a little bit more, maybe something 0.05. There we go. Now we're starting to get in the realm of like photorealism, right? Maybe even 0.1, 0.05, something like that. There you go. So now we're starting to get that that surface information that's really important for even close-up shots. So again, depending on the texture, the resolution of your texture map, the higher resolution, the more information you're going to get, and the closer you can get to that particular object. But for distances that are about this far away, something like that, I mean, for a wood floor or something, I'd be perfectly happy with that. You know, and in fact, I've used this texture map before in like commercial, like high resolution, awesome renderings, but I just use it for like a fixture, like a chair leg, or like, you know, maybe even a floor plank or something, you know. So you get that surface information, and it just looks so much better when you have a little bit more detail to it, right? All right, cool. And so the last and final material we're going to be looking at is a grass material, which we're going to be using. We're going to be creating a displacement map. Right? So I'm going to name this one grass. And we'll leave all this stuff the standard for now. And under my diffuse channel, I'm going to click on bitmap, and I'm going to grab my grass material, right? And I'm going to set that visible, and I'm going to slap it on my sphere there. Cool. Now, obviously it's looking pretty awful right now. A couple things I can do is I can go back out to my full parameter list here, and then I can, if I want to say adjust the color of that, right, I can, I can basically parent a color correction modifier onto this bitmap, right? So I'll do fstorm color correction, and I'll go keep old map as submap, and sometimes it does that, so you have to go back and turn that on. And what I can do here is I can adjust like the overall, like, you know, saturation. I can like offset it so it's lighter. I can make it even more saturated if I want to make it a darker grass or something. I can increase the saturation. I can adjust the hue of it if I want to make it a slightly different color, like a little bit more cartoony or something. You know, all of that is like just parameters you can tweak, and you don't have to necessarily Photoshop stuff, you know. So let's say, you know, I want to bring this back down to like where it was, because I kind of like where it was. 0.5, you know. That's just, I'm just showing you guys stuff that you can do, you know. So with this one, we'll like leave this stuff the same. We'll kind of maybe increase our reflection a little bit there. But what we'll do now is we could do a couple different things. We could create a bump map for the grass, right? And this would be something for like distant grass objects that are in your scene. This is not something that you would want to do for close-up grass. Close-up grass, I would scatter like actual geometry of grass onto the grass surface. But then further distance, you can use a texture map and a displacement map, right? And it's just like a little bit way of cheating that allows the rendering to be cheaper and take less time to produce, right? So you can tell that even if I increase the bump map, let's say on my wood here, we'll go back to our wood example. If I increase the bump map to something like 20, like make it super bumpy, right? I mean, you can't really tell, but if we zoom way into it, let's do something like 5. You can tell that you can still see the faceting of the edges of the material. The bump only affects the surface of the shader, and it doesn't affect it doesn't represent geometry, right? But that's the difference. That's what displacement does, right? So we'll cover displacement now. So let's set that back down. What was that? 0.05, something like that. Yeah. Anyway, so we'll kind of zoom back out here, and what we'll do now is we're going to go ahead and create a displacement map, which is different than a bump map. And for this example, we're not going to be using Photoshop, even though we can. I think the newer Photoshop CC has the ability to create normal and displacement maps. But I like to use this software called Crazy Bump. And maybe I'll leave a link in the description below. I think it's still a free software. I don't remember. Regardless, if I think let me just hang on. So Crazy Bump is awesome. Now it's very simple, right? It's literally just for creating normal and displacement maps and stuff like that. I mean, it's really super robust and really cool. It's super easy to use, right? Crazy Bump, there's a free version of it. I think there's a free like trial version, and I think a regular license costs $100, which is what I paid for it a number of years ago, and I still use it today because it's so fast. It's super easy, and it's like what you see is what you get, and I love that. So what we'll do is once you first open Crazy Bump, you can click open. You can open photograph from file, and we'll go ahead and open our grass. Now, if you're purchasing a material from textures.com, let's say for instance, type grass, a lot of these textures have, some of these textures have height maps, right? Which is effectively a displacement map. And they have normal maps and stuff like that. But in the case that you just Google an image and you don't have that information, you don't have a displacement or normal map, you got to make one if you want that surface information, right? So we'll go ahead and select this shape, right? And what it does is it gives you a preview of what the normal map is going to look like, or in this case, the displacement, what that's going to look like on the actual object, which is pretty awesome. And I can increase or decrease the intensity. I'll decrease the intensity a little bit. I can increase like the very fine detail. Maybe we'll boost that up a little bit. Maybe we'll like lower the large detail, because we don't want too much like intense surface variation. We just want like, actually, for this example, kind of just blast that out a little bit so I'll show you what that looks like. Awesome. So that looks cool. Now what I'll do is I will, with the displacement channel selected here, I'm going to go ahead and save. I'm going to save displacement to file, and we'll just do grass displace. It just names it for you as a JPEG. Save. Awesome. And I'll close down Crazy Bump because we don't need it anymore. That's how fast it is. It's awesome. Okay, so now on our sphere, what I'll do is I'm going to toss on a F-storm displacement modifier, right? And if I want to use displacement, I got to use the F-storm displacement modifier. And I think V-Ray has a similar modifier. Actually, I think you can use normal maps in V-Ray and Corona, but you can't necessarily use normal maps in the material itself. Something to do with the GPU engine, so I'm not totally sure why, but it has to be this modifier. So we'll just toss on a F-storm bitmap, and that just put it here. So we'll go ahead and drag that and drop it onto one of our swatches as an instance. So if we change any of these parameters here, it's going to automatically change anywhere else you have it applied. And I'm going ahead and under File, I'm going to select our grass displacement that we just created. Click Open. And then that applied it to the object, right? So now that's all we need to do. And under the power is where we can adjust that. We'll go ahead and refresh this. Boom. Now you can see what the difference was, is that the edges of the material are going to have that geometric displacement, right? It's going to have that surface deviation, that variation. I can crank this up a little bit if I want to. Let's make 5. And I'll go ahead and refresh it. It's going to be like, wow, that's some serious, intense grass ball. Almost looks like moss or something. But you could tell, I mean, like this is like super mega fast to render this because there's no actual geometry. It's just reading that surface information from the texture map, which is awesome. Okay? So stuff like this is awesome for rendering, moss or grass or whatever at a distance. And if you're going to do something closer up, I would always tend to use actual geometry and scatter it for super close-up shots of stuff like that. But regardless, now you know how to use displacement maps. And the last thing that we're going to look at is using the UVW Map modifier. So for this case, maybe we'll use our wood example because it's a little bit simpler. And we'll just go ahead and create a cube here or something. And we'll just make this 25 by 25 by 25. Cool. And I'm going to toss on our wood material. Right? Now, what if I want to control the grain of the wood? And how do I adjust the material? Well, you can adjust it globally. In here, you can adjust the tiling if you want to. You can adjust the rotation and stuff like that. But that's kind of like a dumb way of doing it because it's going to change it globally on every single material that you have this applied to. And I just want to change this cube. I don't want to change this sphere, right? So what I'll do is under your modifier stack for this particular object, I'm going to drop this down, I'm going to scroll down, I'm going to choose UVW Map, right? Now you can already tell what it did. It created a planar map. So the plane is facing in the XY plane, in the XY direction. So if I refresh my scene so we can see our cube here, it's basically just like wrapping that texture map on the sides of the cube, and we don't really want that, right? So I can set this to be a box, right? And let me just go ahead and shrink this up so you guys can see what it's doing. And now that I set that as a box, I can go ahead and refresh this. Awesome. So now what I can do is I can I can play with all these different settings. There's spherical, there's shrink wrap, there's face. If I want the exact same size map on every single face, it's going to apply that map to the bounds of the face of each face of the geometry, right? But let's say, for instance, if I want to adjust the texture itself, right now it's kind of boring. So what I can do is, the way I did that is you can drop down this little drop down here and click on Gizmo, or you can just if you click away from it, if it's highlighted blue, click on something else or whatever, blah, blah, blah. If it's blue, I can click on it again and it'll just have this blue box around it. And that way I can adjust the texture map, right? So now I'm not moving the object, I'm moving the UVW map modifier gizmo, okay? So I can adjust the scale of this. Let's say if I want I want the faces facing the same orientation. Turn on my angle snaps here. Something like that. Now the grain, I want this grain to face downward or something, and I can adjust the map to do whatever I want, right? Which is pretty cool. And I can adjust this, kind of get it almost seamless, something like that. Cool. So that's looking like a pretty cool little cube there. And I can always increase the scale of it or something. So now that this tutorial is almost an hour long, That's pretty much the extent of what we're going to be able to cover during this video. There's so much more. There's so much more to materials, right? You can do so much with all the different parameters of these different materials. I mean, this is just a few that we came up with, right? Just this is stuff that I use all the time. You know, just a quick overview. We created a simple glossy plastic sort of material. We created a solid glass, a glass that has a thickness to it, right, and show the different look that you get from having a glass that has a shelled thickness to it versus a solid solid mass. And we created a chrome and different variations of metallic materials, right, an emissive material, a volumetric material, um, a wood material that has a bump map for surface variation for the grain, and a grass material that has displacement map for the surface variation, right? The surface information. So these are like fun. This is like the fundamental set of materials that I use all the time, and just by like tweaking materials and the parameters, you can literally make any kind of material you can think of just by these fundamental set of parameters that we looked at today. And of course, you can go further down the rabbit hole and create things like car paint, which has reflective information in the paint and stuff like that. It's it can get infinitely more complex from here, right? And things that I'd like to cover in future videos are things like the UVW Unwrap modifier, and that's for things like creating unwrapping things for to use in games and stuff like that. So you can explode this particular sphere into individual unwrapped objects. Then you can paint in Photoshop or bring into Substance Painter or whatever. So there's a million really cool things you can do with materials, and with that, I hope you guys liked the tutorial, and please let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to reach out in the comment section below, and let me know what you thought of the video. If you found this to be helpful, if you were confused on any particular, materials or settings or anything that we looked at during the duration of the video, please feel free to let me know. And if you liked the video, please smash the like button and subscribe for more. Next up, I think we're going to be focusing more specifically on lighting and render settings, even further in depth. We lightly touched on that today, but definitely something that I would like to do a little course on next. So again, yeah, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.